Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Our topics for tonight are European elections, Biden complicity, and Israel guilty of crimes against the humanity. Grievous topics, I know. Let me get right into it. Sorry, it's taking me a while to find the article that I want to share. Oh, here it is. Okay, there we go. You should be seeing it right now. Hey, Steve, how you doing? Also want to share this on Facebook before I get started. Yeah. Okay. So, this article appeared in Common Dreams, and the name of it is European Elections, Far-Right Recruits for the War Against Humanity. Wow. The rise of the far right, predictable in the absence of an organized and disruptive left, brings new troops to a battle progressives cannot afford to lose. This article is by Yao Camargo. As I said, it's from Common Dreams, July 13th, 2024. The far right won the 2024 European elections. But that was happening in the European Union even before the polls opened. The attempt to normalize the current situation by promoting the description that a, quote, pro-European center has withstood the electoral clash is just a mystification. The far right is not one political force, but several. More than anything, the far right is a political program, which is increasingly dominating the European Union on migration, on climate, on general hatred. That, I think, is very well put. Let's start with numbers, which are the usual way of, quote, normalizing, unquote, mystifications. Of the 720 members of the European Parliament, the, quote, uh, uh, the official, quote, far right, unquote, the one that will still be described as extreme for a few more months, divided between ID, Identity and Democracy, and ECR, Conservatives and Reformists, elected 131 members of the European Parliament, which would make it the third largest group in the Parliament between the European People's Party and the Social Democrats. However, there are at least 40 more far-right MEPs in the non-aligned and other groups. These include the 15 AfD members of parliament in Germany, the 10 Fidesz members of parliament in Hungary, and the 5 AUR MEPs in Romania. That's another 30 MEPs. With these numbers, the far right will effectively be the second force in the European Parliament, even if they are not all officially in the same group. The party with the most MEPs in the entire European Parliament is Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, with 30. The third party with the most MMPs is the Fratelli d'Italia with 24. The fifth is Poland's PIS with 20, tied with the Italian PD and the Spanish PSOE. In Germany, the largest EU country, the far right was the second most voted party. Excluding coalitions, the far right was the most voted party in 8 countries: France, Italy, Poland, the Netherlands, Austria, Belgium, Hungary, and Latvia. As if the above information wasn't enough, there are essential questions to ask about the remaining parties. Political programs from across the political spectrum have been drawn into the black hole of far-right hatred. This is why political aberrations such as the so-called Alliance Bündnis Sarah Wegenecht, a party with a racist and nationalist program that presents itself as left, quote unquote, have emerged. The German government, led by the Social Democrats, theoretically center-left, and the Greens, governs with a right-wing policy in almost every area, from the environment to migration, obviously including the slaughter in Palestine. The response in the elections put them below any of the right-wing parties. Why vote for imitations when there are those who aren't ashamed of being fascists? In France, too, Macron's turn to the right didn't stop the rise of the Rassemblement National, RN, which got more than twice as many votes as the official neoliberal party. Following the call for elections, the leader of the Republicans, Nicolas Sarkozy's former party, has already declared that he would support a far-right French government led by the RN. There is no red line, but a far-right policy is more than the number of MEPs who are admittedly far-right. It must be clear that the electoral programs of the overwhelming majority of the parties of the European People's Party, the official winner of the elections, are far-right, anti-migrant, nationalist, anti-worker programs advocating a return to the past and the historical hatreds of Europeans against women, against Muslims, against Jews, against blacks, and other ethnic minorities, against the LGBTQ community. And of course, they are science denialist programs and consequently climate crisis denialists, disguising their service to the big multinationals as, quote, economic realism, unquote. And the European Union's policy will therefore be an extreme right-wing policy in which the neoliberal precepts will be maintained, dropping any masks. The European Union serves to keep European multinationals making profits for their shareholders and managers. And if we're honest, That's what the European Union has always done, but albeit in the past with a bit of a makeover. So, what will change? The institutions will continue to use their various branches, legislative, executive, judicial, coercive, and media, to guarantee the deepening of the climate crisis and ensure the collapse of humanity. However, the alliance that governs Europe has been given the green light to apply institutional violence, police and military, and spread hatred from the top, encouraging an even greater breakdown of the already fragile societies that exist in this structural crisis of capitalism. The first test will come soon with the return of the fiscal rules of the European semester, which means nothing more than the return of the cruel austerity we know from after the 2008 financial crisis. But the jackhammer of the climate crisis will not stop. It is a war waged by governments and companies against society, and it will only get worse in the coming years. The rise of the far right, predictable in the absence of an organized and disruptive left, brings new troops to this war against humanity. Now, when the stability of our planet and our societies is fluctuating like never before, now that even the venerable institutions of national, European, and global capitalism are beginning to fall one after the other into the hands of fascism, will the focus of the political left remain on institutions and a return to the pre-far right past period? Since real politics is not simply the sum of small agglomerations of ideas, but of concrete political problems, what would be the program for the sudden appeal of a union of those on the left? We already know there are several crises, but what is the political program that responds to the essential political issues of our time? Will the left have the courage to assume that capitalism has declared a war to the death against humanity? Will we recognize that capitalism is actively recruiting an ever larger part of society to kill the other through far-right politics? If so, do we agree to organize ourselves to win this war? Question mark. So this is appeal to people to organize against very negative forces that seem to have taken over politics and that seem to bring hate and suffering to the table, in Europe. Okay. I don't know if they agree to organize themselves in Europe to win this war. That is the left. There are lots of talk of popular fronts, in many countries, but it's surely relevant to ask, as the author does, what is the political program that responds to the essential political issues of our time? What is the political problem that responds to the assassination of the economy of Germany by the United States through destruction of the pipeline? What is the political program that responds to that? I was reading an article the other day saying that 2/3 of its companies have left Germany and established headquarters in other nations. What is the political program that responds to that? What is the political program that's going to respond to austerity? What's the political program that's going to respond to hate and that's going to unify people? What is the answer? I think it had better be eco-socialism or we are all doomed. Well, I will leave that piece with that particular commentary. I move to the second piece, which is from Truth Out. There's a lawsuit going on in this country. And the headline is about that lawsuit. Palestinians ask federal court to rule Biden is complicit in Israeli genocide. Quote, genocide can never be a legitimate foreign policy choice, unquote, plaintiffs argue in case against Biden, Blinken, and Austin. This one is by Marjorie Cohn, June 14th, 2024. She is the outstanding writer on legal matters at Truth Out. Sharon Zhang is very good too, but Marjorie Cohn is really magnificent when it comes to legal matters. So, the photo I just flashed in front of you shows the three members getting sued. In the background, I recognize Gina Raimondo, who's the Secretary of Commerce, pictured in the cabinet room of the White House on March 10, 2022, in Washington, D.C. Okay, by the way, March 10th of 2022 was just as the United States, with the help of the United Kingdom, was torpedoing the agreement that had been made by Russia with the Ukraine to end the war which had recently started. 600,000 fatalities later. Yes, I agree with the fatality estimates of Scott Ritter and Colonel McGregor. I think 600,000 Ukrainians have died. A lawsuit accusing U.S. President Joe Biden, some of his top officials, of complicity in genocide, had its latest hearing this week after being dismissed earlier in the year. On June 10th, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco heard arguments in the plaintiff's appeal in Defense for Children International, Palestine versus Biden. Lawsuit was filed on November 13, 2023 by the Center for Constitutional Rights on behalf of Palestinian human rights organizations Defense for Children International Palestine, DCI-P, and Al-Haq, as well as 3 Palestinian individuals who live in Gaza and 5 Palestinian Americans who have family in Gaza. It is quote, it is unfathomable that we are still here today, unquote. Plaintiff Wael El-Bassi stated at a press conference following the appellate argument. Although CCR filed this lawsuit in November, quote, again, the genocide continues with the same intensity, with the same cruelty, unquote, he noted, adding that many more of his relatives have been murdered in the last 6 months. Quote, people are trying to flee because they're fleeing death. They're literally trapped in a killing field, unquote, he said. The plaintiffs allege that Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin are engaging in complicity in genocide and failure to prevent genocide in violation of the Genocide Convention and customary international law, which is part of federal common law. Yeah, we can never forget that. The Genocide Convention and customary international law are both part of federal common law. They're the law of the land here. Plaintiffs are asking the court to issue an injunction preventing the Biden administration from sending money and weapons to Israel and from obstructing international efforts to implement a ceasefire in Gaza. They also want the court to order the Biden administration to exert influence over Israel to end its bombing of Gaza, lift the siege of Gaza, and prevent the forcible transfer and expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza. And they seek a declaration from the court that defendants are violating their duty under customary international law that prohibits complicity in genocide and requires them to prevent Israel from committing genocide. In other words, Joe Biden, stop shipping those arms. Cut off the arms shipments. In an earlier hearing on January 26th, U.S. District Judge Jeffrey White characterized the testimony he heard from the Palestinian American plaintiffs as, quote, truly horrific, gut-wrenching, no words to describe it, unquote. He noted that the government did not dispute the uncontradicted evidence of a, quote, genocide in progress, unquote. The quote again, the Palestinian people are living in fear and without food, medical care, clean water, or sufficient humanitarian aid, unquote, White said. And, quote, yet again, defendants, the President of the United States and his Secretaries of State and Defense have provided substantial military, financial, and diplomatic support to Israel, unquote. Nevertheless, on January 31st, White reluctantly dismissed the case based on, quote, on the, quote, political question, unquote, doctrine, which reserves foreign policy decisions to the political branches of government, executive and legislative, not the judiciary. This leaves the court with no jurisdiction to check the executive in this case. Now, I have to say, at this point, I don't understand this. The political question doctrine is a doctrine propounded by the Supreme Court itself, but it is not enshrined in law anywhere. It is not in the Constitution anywhere. It's just judiciary rules. The Genocide Convention is common law. It's the common law of the land. It's set by treaty. Treaty stands higher than regular legislation. If treaty matters cannot be adjudicated by the judiciary based on the political question doctrine, where can they be adjudicated? Certainly, if a law is passed by Congress, the interpretations and the execution of that law can be challenged in a court of law. What the political question doctrine is saying is that because we have foreign policy involved, that the protection of the law is not provided to people by the judiciary. But nowhere does it say that in the Constitution. Nowhere does it say that in the law. Does the legislature have to pass laws saying that the judiciary is not to apply the political question doctrine to foreign policy matters? What has to be done for the courts to recognize exceptions? I mean, this is a case of genocide. What good is the Genocide Convention if you cannot litigate under it? At the same time, White wrote, the judge wrote, quote, it is plausible that Israel's conduct amounts to genocide, unquote, and the evidence and testimony, quote, indicate the ongoing military siege in Gaza is intended to eradicate a whole people, unquote. White exhorted the Biden administration to, quote, examine the results of their unflagging support, unquote, of Israel. Marjorie Cohn contends, as I just did, that the legal duty to prevent genocide is not a, quote, political question, unquote. In the appeal, CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights, argued that the court could make a finding that the defendants are engaging in complicity to commit genocide and failure to prevent genocide without making a foreign policy decision. Further, the defendants have a legal duty to refrain from genocide. So the political question doctrine does not prevent the court from examining the Biden administration's provision of military, financial, and diplomatic assistance to Israel's genocide. Quote, plaintiffs reject defendant's suggestion that international embarrassment can come only from questioning conduct of an ally, Israel, and not instead from the U.S. open breach of its international law obligations to prevent and not further a genocide, an obligation reaffirmed by the International Court of Justice, CCR wrote in the appellant's reply brief. Quote, genocide can never be a legitimate foreign policy choice, unquote. CCR staff attorney Catherine Gallagher told circuit judges Jacqueline Guyen, Daniel Bress, and Consuelo Maria Callahan during the June 10th argument. This case is about whether the judicial branch is, quote, powerless, unquote, when the executive branch violates international law, she said. The Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts, quote, committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, unquote, including killing members of the group, inflicting serious bodily or mental harm on members of the group, or deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction in whole or in part. The International Court of Justice found a plausible case that Israel was committing genocide. The Genocide Convention also forbids complicity in genocide and imposes a duty to prevent genocide, which is erga omnes, binding on all countries. Individuals can be complicit in genocide by knowingly providing assistance for its commission, even if they don't share the perpetrator's specific intent to commit genocide. Genocide also violates customary international law and is considered a jus cogens prohibition, which means no country can ever legalize it. But the three-judge panel appeared unmoved by the plaintiff's contentions. Callahan, a George W. Bush appointee, asked Gallagher whether a federal court would be, quote, second-guessing, unquote, U.S. ally Israel if it opined in the case. Bress, a Trump appointee, worried that the court would be, quote, running the U.S. military, unquote. Guyen, an Obama appointee, was concerned the court would have to, quote, condemn the foreign policy choices of the political branch, unquote. Oh, Jesus. Aren't you so worried about that when there's a genocide in question? I mean, don't you just fear these terrible things that the court might do when there's a genocide in question? Give me a break. Going on, Gallagher replied that the judicial branch can review executive conduct to ensure it complies with the law. Quote, yeah, pretty obvious. Here, reviewing executive conduct, whether it is aiding and abetting the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part, it is the responsibility of the court to review that conduct against the clearly established definition of genocide, of complicity in genocide, unquote, she said. And quote again, quote, the Supreme Court made clear that even in moments of crisis, the executive is still bound by law, unquote. She cited 4 cases in which the Supreme Court set limits on executive actions during the George W. Bush administration's, quote, war on terror, including Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, where the court reaffirmed that, quote, a state of war is not a blank check for the president. Will the court give the president, quote, a blank check to slaughter a civilian population, unquote? Plaintiff Ahmed Abu Artema participated in the post-hearing press conference by audio from Gaza. In October, the Israel military targeted his house and killed 6 members of his family, including his 13-year-old son, Abdallah. Quote, I was so consumed by agony that I could scarcely feel the pain of the second-degree burns covering my own body, unquote. Israeli forces blew up Abu Artema's apartment in Khan Yunis. Quote, I am now, like everyone else in Gaza, homeless. I sleep on sidewalks, or what used to be sidewalks, unquote. Beher Azmi, CCR's legal director, called the plaintiffs, quote, incredibly courageous, unquote, noting that they, quote, collectively have lost hundreds of family members in the ongoing genocide. Azmi said the U.S. is sending, quote, billions of dollars of weapons of mass slaughter, starvation, and destruction, unquote, that are, quote, intentionally and knowingly used on the civilian population for the purpose of effectuating the genocidal campaign to destroy the Palestinian people in Gaza, unquote. The Biden administration didn't dispute that there's an ongoing genocide. Quote, after all, how could they, unquote, Azmi asked. Quote, again, it is open and notorious, unquote. The question is whether the courts will give the government, quote, a blank check to slaughter a civilian population. Ultimately, he said, this administration will no doubt be condemned for their cowardice and for their complicity, unquote. Of course they will. Of course they will. We have been condemning them for their cowardice and complicity for months now. Plaintiff Ayman Najim noted that since Gaza is among the most densely populated areas in the world, and children make up 52% of the population, quote, you know you will hit children, unquote, when Israel drops its bombs. The Najim's family members were forcibly displaced in 1948 from their home in the northern village of Ashdod and have been refugees in Gaza since. They are hosting more than 120 members of their extended family who have fled northern Gaza. Last week, plaintiff Bassem Al-Kara lost 10 family members in one attack. More than 90 of his relatives have been killed. Many are still missing. Quote, today we heard the Biden administration's lawyers say, quote, we can't commit genocide without any kind of accountability. There's no check on us, no law, when we decide the policy we want to support is genocidal, Gallagher stated. Quote, that's a terrifying proposition. U.S. Circuit Court Judge Ryan Nelson, a Trump appointee, agreed to recuse himself from this case after the plaintiff's words. He is one of 14 U.S. judges who participated in a March visit to Israel sponsored by the World Jewish Congress. In a delegation met with Israeli legal and military officials, quote, was explicitly designed to influence U.S. judicial opinion regarding the legality of ongoing Israeli military action against Palestinians. A core question on appeal of this case, plaintiffs wrote in their motion to disqualify Nelson. Callahan replaced Nelson on the 3-judge panel. CCR hopes the non-circuit will issue a decision in the next couple of months. If the panel rules against the plaintiffs, CCR will likely ask the entire appeals court to hear the case en banc, which requires the agreement of a majority of the 30-judge court. If that petition is denied or if it's granted and CCR loses after an en banc hearing, they can file a petition for certiorari in the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's making its way up the ladder of the courts, taking all kinds of time. The more time is taken, of course, the more people die in Gaza. And the courts are doing nothing about enforcing the obligations of the United States, comply with its treaty obligations. That's how terrible it is. That's how lawless this is. That's how tragic this is. And what's at issue? What is at issue is a custom of the Supreme Court, a custom of the Supreme Court that because this is a political question, it cannot be adjudicated in the Supreme Court. I'm sorry. Genocide is a serious enough matter for it to be adjudicated in the Supreme Court. God, that's really disgusting, isn't it? Just plain disgusting. Okay. So the last piece I want to cover is a piece of news from the UN Commission reported on in Portside. It originally comes from Jacobin. UN Commission finds Israel guilty of crimes against humanity. Okay. A new report by UN Commission finds that Israel intended to murder civilians en masse, inflict wide-scale civilian destruction, and collectively punish Palestinians in Gaza, holding them hostage to its political aims. This was June 18th, 2024, only a day old. The author is Bashir Abu Maneh. Here's a photo of children standing barefoot, okay, in the ruins. Palestinian girls in the Bureiji refugee camp in Gaza on June 16th, 2024. The photo is by Majdi Fathi, Noor photo via Getty Images. Amazing. The UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory issued its, quote, first in-depth investigation into the events that took place on and since 7th of October 2023, unquote. The report holds the Israeli occupation responsible for the ongoing catastrophic situation in Gaza, but it also alludes to the possibility that October 7th is a watershed moment for even harsher Israeli occupation unless international law is urgently implemented. When both Hamas and Israel are found to have committed war crimes, including sexual violence, Israel is also sanctioned for committing, quote, crimes against humanity of extermination, gender persecution targeting Palestinian men and boys, murder, forcible transfer, and torture and inhuman and cruel treatment, unquote. In clear and deliberate violation of international law, which undoubtedly has been going on, Israel intended to commit these crimes to murder civilians en masse, inflict widespread civilian destruction, and collectively punish and dehumanize Palestinians in Gaza. Collective punishment, of course, is a war crime. Palestinians were murdered. They didn't die as collateral damage or as unintended victims of Israeli military operations, but as Israel's deliberate targets. The immense numbers of civilian casualties in Gaza and widespread destruction of civilian objects and infrastructure were the inevitable result of a strategy undertaken with intent to cause the maximum damage, disregarding the principles of distinction, proportionality, and adequate precautions. The intentional use of heavy weapons with large destructive capacity in densely populated areas constitutes an intentional and direct attack on the civilian population. such widespread and systematic destruction of whole neighborhoods in Gaza is consistent with the application of the Dahia doctrine in Gaza, in which civilian infrastructure is deliberately destroyed as part of a strategy of collective punishment, but reminiscent of Israel's war on Lebanon in 2006. And by the way, Israel appears now to be embarking on yet another war in Lebanon involving collective punishment. The Commission does leave the question of genocide for the ongoing investigation of the International Court of Justice to adjudicate, but it nevertheless accuses Israel of holding the whole civilian population in Gaza hostage to achieve its declared political and military aims. If Israel has falsely and persistently accused Hamas of employing, quote, human shields, unquote, since 2008, the UN has yet again found that in practice, it is Israel that employs this illegal tactic. Indeed, when opponents of the West take hostages, officials, and mainstream media dub them terrorists by violently punishing Palestinians to achieve its political aims, Israel employs a textbook case of terror. As stated in the Oxford Open Letter on the Humanitarian Crisis in Gaza, as early as October 20th, 2023, to think that the atrocities perpetrated by Hamas justify the humanitarian crisis currently unfolding in Gaza is to indulge a central tenet of terrorism that all citizens must pay for the misdeeds of their governments, as well as terrorism's central practice, collective punishment. As shown by investigative journalist Yuval Abraham, Israel does in fact use such terror tactics systematically in Gaza. In addition to retribution, Israel has also weaponized aid as part of its war on Gaza and employed starvation as a weapon of war. The Commission identified, quote, an intention to instrumentalize and weaponize the provision of necessities to hold the population of the Gaza Strip hostage to achieve political and military objectives, including the forced displacement of civilians from the northern Gaza Strip and the release of Israeli hostages. While basic subsistence necessities are blocked by military siege, the high acute insecurity, quote unquote, is, quote again, the compounded result of the destruction and prevention of local food production, including agriculture, fishing, and baking, unquote. Essential Palestinian human needs are callously violated and degraded by Israel, with the result that, quote, as of March 2024, the situation is continuing to deteriorate. 1.1 million people face catastrophic levels of food insecurity, unquote. The policy of deliberate mass dehumanization of Palestinians is identified here. If this is not damning enough, the report accuses Israel not only of failing to protect its citizens on October 7, 2023, but through its illegal occupation for being ultimately responsible for the root cause of violence in Israel-Palestine. This explanatory context is crucial. Both the 7th of October attack in Israel and Israel's subsequent military operation in Gaza must be seen in context. These events were preceded by decades of violence, unlawful occupation, and Israel's denial of the Palestinians' right to self-determination, manifested in continuous forced displacement, dispossession, exploitation of natural resources, blockade, settlement construction and expansion, and systematic discrimination and oppression of the Palestinian people. So important to recognize that context, as this quote has done. So important to put the 7th of October attack in this context, because obviously the attack occurred because of this context. It was Hamas responding to the context of the unlawful occupation and to the prospect that the occupation would continue forever because at the time Israel was about to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, but basically permanently freezing the state of the unlawful occupation while the Arab countries normalized their relations with Israel and accepted the international crime of permanent occupation, okay, and apartheid. Hamas attacked on the 7th of October to put the rights of the Palestinians back on the table, including their right of self-determination. That is what they did. People seem to think, and it may have been true, that there was some atrocities committed in the context of this execution of the right of resistance by the Palestinians. But that doesn't change the fact that the basic attack, the foundation of the attack, was an exercise of the right of resistance against unlawful occupation. That's what it was about. That's what most of the violence was about. Generally speaking, the attack was justified. Of course, human rights crimes in the context of the attack were not justified, but those were human rights crimes, okay, of individuals, not human rights crimes of Hamas, generally speaking. There's no evidence, there's no indication that any policy of Hamas involved the violation of the human rights of the Israeli citizens themselves. Occupation as root cause is invoked in the report's conclusion as well. It sits at the foundation of the sexual and gender-based violence Israel intentionally uses against Palestinians to humiliate their community. Quote, this violence is intrinsically linked to the wider context of inequality and prolonged occupation, which have provided the conditions and the rationale for gender-based crimes to further accentuate the subordination of the occupied people. What then is the solution to Israel's retaliatory and persecutory acts? The end of the Israeli occupation. As the report states, quote, these crimes must be addressed by tackling their root cause through dismantling the historically oppressive structures and institutionalized system of discrimination against Palestinians, which are at the core of the occupation. Despite official talk about fighting terrorism and Israel's bogus right to defend itself against those it occupies, identifying the occupation as the underlying reason for violence is key. I so couldn't agree more with this piece. It's really wonderfully clear. It ultimately puts the onus of responsibility on Israel itself, where peace can only be achieved, quote, by strict adherence to international law, unquote, by ending the Israeli occupation and recognizing the Palestinian right of self-determination. That is so true. In an atmosphere in which explaining context and identifying root causes are tarred with anti-Semitism or justifying terror, the Commission's sober conclusion is a powerful defense of the oppressed. Importantly, a note of warning is sounded at the end. October 7th might well usher in more occupation rather than peace. It's a significant historic judgment to contemplate. Quote, 7th of October 2023 has marked a clear turning point for both Israelis and Palestinians, and it presents a watershed moment that can change the direction of this conflict with a real risk of further solidifying and expanding the occupation. Even though Israel, in line with its legal obligations as occupier, owes Palestinians reparations for destroying Gaza and should reconstruct Gaza now, it is likely to do the opposite, entrench its occupation, unleash its settlers in the West Bank even further, and block any meaningful restitution of Palestinian life in Gaza. This is in part a judgment on the catastrophic effect the Hamas's October 7th military operation on the Palestinians. It is a clear recognition that the current balance of power obviates against Palestinian rights, as well as an implicit acknowledgement of the obstacles that stand in the way of turning the real assets of international law to political reality. Ending the Israeli occupation requires a coherent Palestinian strategy of emancipation that uses the impressive widespread grassroots support for this just cause across the world and helps transform global solidarity to state policies, isolating Israel internationally and forcing it to pay the cost of its illegal occupation. This is the challenge that Palestinians now face after the Gaza Nakba. As I say, I think that was just a wonderful article, making the case so clearly, just so clearly. It was wonderful. We still have a few minutes left before I have to get over to Dee's stream. Of course, I'm assuming she has a stream tonight. I haven't recently checked, so I don't really know. But Robert Copeland says genocide is wrong, no matter which nation is committing the genocide. I do want to say a little something about a good result in the primary elections in Virginia last night. I've spoken in one or two of the previous streams of the contest for Congress in the Virginia 10th between Dan Helmer and a whole host of people, but the main other contender was Suhas Subramaniam, who is he formerly worked for the Obama White House, and he is a member in good standing of the Virginia Democratic establishment political machine. So the election was mainly between Suhas and Dan Helmer. Dan Helmer had been endorsed by the Washington Post. Suhas was endorsed by Jennifer Wexton, the incumbent who's had to retire due to ill health. When we look at the independent expenditures in the cycle so far, and of course this doesn't contain the latest figures, the independent expenditures of the Protect Progress the super PAC, we see that this super PAC gave almost $4 million in this race. And this, of course, is not up to date. It's at the end of, I don't even think it's at the end of May. It's probably at the end of April. Had given $4 million to Dan Helmer. And Dan Helmer's ads were all over the place here. They were all over YouTube. They were all over television. We got mailings from Dan Helmer every single day, sometimes 2 pieces of mail per day. He and his supporters had a huge amount of money to burn. Dan Helmer had, in addition to the $4 million from that particular super PAC, He also raised considerable money on his own. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing here. I have to get to the candidates to talk about this. Hang on just a second while I get to the state. Okay. In the Virginia 10th for this open seat, Dan Helmer raised 1,548,739 and spent 1,012,389. Ended with cash on hand of 536,350. This was as of May 29th. Suhas, okay, Subramanian, raised 1,044,605, and he spent $758,798. So he was outraised and outspent by Dan Helmer, not counting, of course, the independent expenditures that we saw from Protect Progress. Let me get to the outside spending category here. We can see that apart from the $4 million from that one super PAC, Dan Helmer had another roughly $1.5 million in support of him from other super PACs. There was $500,000 in outside spending in favor of Suhas Subramanian. Anyway, okay, I'm getting to the point. Okay, even though between the super PAC support and the funds he raised, Suhas was operating with $1.5 million. Dan Helmer was operating with $7 million, okay, by the end of May. That doesn't count any last minute spending in June, which, believe me, was dense and was considerable. Okay, we'll see if we can see the result here. We can see if we can get the results. Hopefully they have them recorded already. I don't know if they do. Oh, by the way, they were all well supported by well-off donors. Neither Dan Helmer nor Suhas did well in small individual contributions, and nor did the other people running. Okay, so they haven't had a chance to record who won this race here, but I can tell you that Suhas won by a few points. So, in other words, he was able to hold off the challenge, okay, of Dan Helmer, uh, even though Dan Helmer uh, had 5 times the resources Suhas had. He still, Suhas still had enough resources to get his message out. And we got a lot of mailings from him too. So he was able to beat the super PACs. And that is good because uh, it means he was not bought by the super PACs to the same degree, okay, as Dan Helmer would have been. Now, we don't know that much about the super PACs that were supporting Dan Helmer, but the other day I looked up who exactly was supporting Dan Helmer, tried to find out who was behind the Protect Progress Super PAC that was the main Super PAC contributor. Uh, I wasn't able to find out, okay, a lot about him. They might have been cryptocurrency contributors. I think that's a pretty good possibility, but I'm not sure. Historically, Eileen Filicorn, who was the third candidate in the race, who got about 11% of the vote or something like that, uh, she had been historically supported by the tobacco lobby and certain other lobbies. I don't know who made the external expenditures on behalf of Suhas. He got a lot of money in outside spending as well. You can see $500,000. That's a lot of money. Uh, we don't know specifically who contributed to him. We can look at the outside spending again. Okay, the Democratic majority for Israel, I know they were spending for Dan Helmer. Oh, the Impact Fund PAC contributed $584,465. That is the exact amount that went to Suhas. So obviously they were the Suhas supporters. Okay, the DMFI definitely contributed then to Dan Helmer, and they of course are uh, a notorious uh, super PAC that's also closely related, okay, to APAC. I'm going to look up the impact fund here. So they supported 3 races, okay, across the country. in the New Jersey House rates, okay, for Menendez, uh, there was a $50,000. There's $50,000 uh, actually against, okay, Menendez, which is interesting. Okay, but this is the House candidate, Menendez, not the Senate candidate, okay, Menendez. Sushila Jayapal, okay, is Pramila Jayapal's sister. She ran, okay, in Oregon, and she was defeated by big PAC money as well. But she got 158,739 in super PAC dollars from the same super PAC that supported Suhas, okay, Subramaniam. So I still don't have any information though on this super PAC. Let's see if I can get any here. Okay, this is a carry committee, which is a hybrid PAC, super PAC. Let's see if we can get any summary information here. This is a totally new super PAC. It was only active in 2024. It ended with cash on hand and receipts of 240,000. It made independent expenditures of 793,204. The impact fund came from the Democratic Liberal industry. Its location is in Washington, D.C. So some people, we can look up the documents filed at the FEC. FEC Committee ID COO 876-391, Treasurer Sue Jackson. Maybe we can find out more about the fund there. We can't find out much about who they are, but they were a newly formed PAC. They were only organized on April 17th, 2024. Probably somebody wanted Suhas to run. They probably saw all the money Dan Helmer was spending, so they came in support of Suhas. So this was a battle of the super PACs. I think it's important that the super PAC that spent the least amount of money won instead of the super PAC that did the overwhelming spending. But we still don't know the background story of the super PACs, of who was behind them. Statement of organization, look up the PDF. Okay, so the PDF is not there, actually, which I think is of some interest. The organization PDF is not there. How interesting. Okay, so I'm going to stop this now because I have to get over to D. I can't. So we don't know who is behind these particular super PACs. We do know that the election was not successfully bought by the super PACs with the most money who was spending on behalf of Dan Helmer. So that's okay what we can say. But the impact here, okay, of the super PACs was certainly significant, okay, in this race. So, okay, I'm going to leave this now. and consider your comments. Steve says Dee has a show tonight. Okay, I'll get over there in a couple of minutes. Either person received any money from AIPAC? I don't know at this point. Okay, but of course the DMFI often works in concert, with AIPAC. It was actually the DMFI Super PAC that was instrumental in the defeat of Nina Turner, okay, in Ohio, and the election of Chantel Brown twice, okay, if you recall. Okay, so the DMFI, specifically, the Democratic Majority for Israel, is just as poisonous, okay, as AIPAC. It just doesn't have quite as much money, but it did. Anyway, on that note, thank you for the comments. I will be going over to Dee now, so I'll see you tomorrow night with another show. Currently, what I plan for tomorrow night, the show on Medicare for All and Medicare Advantage, and those kinds of considerations. Of course, with international relations going the way it is, I can never know the night before what I'll actually end up covering. Depends on whether there are any international disasters. But I thought it was time for a show on Medicare for All. So that's what I'm going to do tomorrow night, as long as the creeks don't rise in the international system. So thank you for coming, and hopefully I will see you all then. And I'm on my way over to Dee's now.